Mm. Hello. Hello. Welcome to this fourth session of the Beyond Sessions by the Master in Design for Responsible AI here at Elisava in Barcelona. Um, I'm Andrés Colmenares, director of the master, and we are today also live streaming this session. So for those of you watching the live stream or the recording, hello, and for those of you in the room, thanks for spending this lovely spring, almost a spring or spring already, evening here in Barcelona in this room to talk about human rights, design, AI, live, rankings, benchmarks. So, yes, before getting into the topic of today, I just wanted to share a few short messages. First message is that the applications for the next edition of the Master in Design for Responsible AI are open. And we're eager to learn about people who are interested in joining us. Second is that, you're in the screen. Next Thursday, we're doing the final session of these Beyond Sessions by the MDRAI Master on AI and data narratives with Leticia and Cassia. So if you're watching this and want to join, you can go to, I think the website is luma.mdrai, and you can register, share with friends, with people who are interested in all of these topics. And other than that, let's go into the topic of today. It was here. So, very excited to welcome to this session today Caroline and Leandro. Caroline is part of the faculty of the program, coming all the way from London/New Orleans. Yes, and Leandro is a collaborator, very close to the program, who a year ago was sitting on the other side of the room. You're based in Barcelona, but coming all the way from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, so fellow Latin American here. And we're going to learn from them and have a conversation, hopefully with your questions and comments on this idea of designing for human rights or human rights-centered design in the context of AI. So to start, I will invite Caroline first to tell us a little bit more about you and your practice as a machine learning design researcher, artist, and online harassment expert. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Where should we get started? Should just be like a short summary, Andres? What are you thinking?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Caroline Cinders. I'm a human rights researcher, artist, and design researcher. I've been, working in the space of looking at digital rights and online gender-based violence and how technology disproportionately harms marginalized and vulnerable groups for about 11 years now. I used to be a design researcher at IBM Watson. That's where I got interested in AI. I was very interested in how AI could be used in consumer-facing products, and the more and more I was sort of working in that space, the more and more I thought that maybe there should be like less AI in consumer-facing products. I run a small human rights lab called Convocation Research and Design. Our website is convocation.design. It's currently being redesigned, but you can sort of get an in-depth look at our sort of 5 main focus areas. We do a lot of security trainings and security services. We do design work. So if you need service design, UX design, design strategy, we tend to work mainly with internet freedom and digital rights organizations. Recently, we've been working a lot with groups that work on internet censorship circumvention, particularly with human rights defenders and LGBTQI plus organizations inside of Russia, behind the Iron Firewall. We also do a lot of research, so different kinds of mixed methods research. We do policy work, both working with regulators and also working in public policy. And then we also partner with larger organizations to do different kinds of advocacy campaigns, usually related to our policy and research work. I just finished up a postdoc with the UK's Data Protection and Privacy Regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, and I've worked with other organizations like the UN, the Wikimedia Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, and others. We could talk about art, but we're running out of time. Should I pass to Leandro?
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah.
Leandro,
Yeah.
welcome. Bienvenido. And,
Thank you.
Tell us a bit more about your work, your background.
Yeah. First of all,
and let me know if should I.
maybe if you want to.
When you give me
or
the
afterwards.
you give me the prompt.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to start with. But anyways, yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Leandro Ciferri. Hope you can hear me well. It's lovely to be here today and joining Caroline and Andres. After almost a year that I actually was on that side hearing Caroline's work. Yeah. So I'm Leandro. I work as engagement lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. We basically assess companies around the world on their impact on the environment, the planet, and society. I'll get into a lot of what that means just in a bit. I basically work on the digital team. So we assess companies in terms of different standards that we set on our own methodology, which I'll cover today a bit more so in connection to AI and algorithmic systems. But if you're interested in a lot of the other side of what corporate accountability means, happy to stay a bit afterwards if you're interested in other areas outside tech. But yeah, I started my journey in digital rights in 2015 in an organization in Argentina doing more research and public policy analysis on surveillance and privacy, mostly used by the state, by governments. And little by little, I started to sort of like pivot on the role of the private sector. And I've been with Ranking Digital Rights since 2021, and we just merged with the World Benchmarking Alliance at the beginning of last year. So I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But I don't know, Andres, if you want me to kind of like start on a bit of like more on the presentation, or if you wanted to, if you had specific questions.
Yeah, I will. Now that we know a little bit more about Leandro and Caroline. And yeah, it's really exciting that you're both here, and even more exciting to have a conversation today and learn more about, from your experience, your work, what I consider is a very important topic that we have been also exploring in the master, which is the role of human rights in our evolving relation with technology, its impacts, particularly this big idea of AI and AI systems. And I would say that one of the few people in the world that have been working very hard and with very open approach to developing this idea of human rights centered design is here in the room. It's Caroline. So I will ask you to.
There's a lot of us, though.
Of course, yeah, but it's more like you're here, so. Because we could all, and that's kind of an idea that I had. Just ask to those of you in the room if you know any human right. How many human rights do we have? Anybody else? So yeah, that's kind of what I have been realizing as we have been unfolding this idea of responsible AI together with the group and the faculty, is how unaware we are of something as important as human rights in general. Even people like, and I was the first one that I was not really familiar with my human rights. And I feel that as design practitioners, this is becoming increasingly important as mainly because those human rights are in threat increasingly. They're like taking steps backwards, very sadly. But we are here, like, the idea is that by learning about your work, both of you, we come up with this idea of, hope as action, and that it informs what we can do in relation to that in each of our practices, as broadly speaking, as designers. So yeah, we'll start by asking Caroline a little bit about the backstory of this human rights centered design that you, together with a group of people, started to shape in the form of a curriculum, and you have been weaving into your practice. So yeah, what is?
Yeah, so thank you so much. So this is something I've been developing with one of my collaborators, Natalie Cadranel. The website is currently down due to a human rights issue. Actually, that's happening, not a technology issue. We need to sadly redact some names of our collaborators just due to increased pressure from the US government and its impact on a lot of our both domestic and foreign collaborators, sadly. But it should be back online in the next few days. Students, the Secure UX methodology is also on there. The checklist will be back online. Thank you, Juliana, for pointing that out. And I expect you guys to read it, right? Okay. But human rights centered design was this term Natalie and I were throwing around a lot. Natalie has a background actually as a trained archivist. And so but she works a lot with activists, and so do I. I have a background in photojournalism and also in design and technology. And one of the things we sort of noticed is working with different activists, especially ones that build technology, is that design, it's not that it's necessarily an afterthought. It's something that folks often don't have the budget to engage with. We're talking about folks that have, almost like no funding and are building a very necessary tool that their communities need. It can be very difficult when you're building human rights software, for example, to be able to get further funding from human rights or philanthropic funders to continue to maintain and build that software. Sometimes the suggestion is, can you make it open source? Can you have a community of contributors? But also that kind of implies or assumes that in that context, that there is a healthy amount of, by healthy, a large amount of technologists who can contribute and also safely contribute without facing retribution from the state or the government of where they're located. In other contexts, sometimes we have a different scenario in which foreign contributors very much want to help. Sometimes they helicopter in, and sometimes we'll take control of a project, which is not ideal either. But Natalie and I noticed this gap, which was, okay, if funders aren't going to fund design, and there have been some funders that have been very supportive of funding design for human rights internet freedom projects, like the Open Technology Fund. I'm a UX vendor there. There's a special lab. Hopefully they'll keep receiving funding. They're funded by US Congress, so I don't know. But that's also, OTF is who funded us to make human rights centered design. The idea was perhaps if we can start to teach human rights technologists a little bit more about design and how design is so integral to safety, privacy, to the things that they're building. One, we can help sort of alleviate momentarily the need for there to be a designer by teaching some design processes. We found when we were also workshopping and iterating on the curriculum that it actually worked really well with design students who were very interested in learning more about internet freedom, privacy and security, and human rights. And so the reason we call it the Human Rights Centered Design Curriculum is just the need to try to have designers understand that human rights policy and digital rights have a place in our design process. And that means there's a variety of ways to apply it. But it is, again, really thinking about how do you center the most marginalized and vulnerable in your design process. You make stronger design that way. Something we talk about a lot in class is just, if we look at the history of accessibility, that was something fought for by disability activists, like the curb cuts, which accessibility activists, really champion for, are used by all of us. When we are able to center the most vulnerable, we actually make things that all of us can use. And I see this a lot in my own work when I work with folks facing, even the majority world global north. online gender-based violence, for example, or intimate partner violence that could happen to any of us in this room. When you advocate for more pro-privacy and security and like safer design, if you will, inside of products, it works for both human rights defenders and those facing all different kinds of online harassment.
Thank you, Caroline, and I will pass the mic to Leandro and ask you to tell us a bit more this ranking digital rights index that you have been working in the last few years, a bit of the methodology, the evolution, and also the context of the work that you are doing at the World Benchmarking Alliance in relation to this intersection of digital transformation, digital inclusion, AI, right? That is, of course, what is bringing us together these days. So I will now probably shift to this. Yep.
Thanks. Should I tell you kind of like next slides and
give me like
a cue? Yeah, you can move to the next one. So yeah, as I was sharing earlier, so at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we assess companies. Within the digital team, we focus on 200 companies globally, and I'll try to make it as less confusing as possible in terms of like how RDR is connected with WBA, because it's all sort of like very recent. But before getting into that, I just wanted to sort of like give you an overview of the why. And you all sort of like already have some hints into the, the concerns of unchecked power on corporations and sort of like the scope of the issue in terms of how the concentration of power when it comes to tech companies is increasingly, I guess, expanding in terms of the power, but shrinking in terms of the amount of players that have, can wield that, just to shape not only the technology that we use every day, but also how we implement it in society, how we have agency as people, as human beings, to decide how that technology is actually shaped, how it evolves, thanks to the power of lobbying, basically, that a lot of these companies exert just throughout the world. So that's why we take a sort of like very specific focus in terms of understanding how human rights play a role in basically holding companies accountable on their commitments to respect human rights. And to do that, we basically developed a set of different methodologies, touching on different aspects of human rights, but also on digital inclusion as in terms of like how they work in a sort of like symbiosis to strengthen each other, right? From access to technology, access to education, from the concept of using tech, programs to ensure equity for that access or for the distribution of specific tech, to how different communities can actually enjoy different technologies, to more specific aspects of human rights like privacy and freedom of expression. So if you go to the next slide, awesome. I can start with a bit of history and context. So starting with ranking digital rights, which is the program I first started working in 2021. So just to give you some kind of like contextual history, in 2012, Rebecca McKinnon, which I don't know if you're familiar with her, she now is the VP of Advocacy at Wikimedia. But Rebecca wrote a book called Consent of the Networked in 2012, with basically the premise around how we need to shift our attention to the unchecked power of tech corporations. Before the 2010s, there was a lot of optimism in the tech ecosystem in terms of how companies were seen mostly as, allies in fighting government oppression, in fighting government censorship. There was a really, kind of like positive optimism around internet freedom and the role that companies can play, for example, with, gathering communities, enabling new channels of communication, making sure that people have a voice when rising up to protest against authoritarianism. But there was increasingly, the whole concept of how these companies are beginning to be just concentrating power from the perspective of their closeness to the political ecosystem and their closeness or their ties to specific regimes, and the sort of like behind the desk deals of how the data is managed, the data is collected, processed, and the underlying issues of the business models fueling the growth of the companies themselves. So the whole premise of Rebecca's book was basically how can we shift attention to start, understanding the impact of companies and basically putting pressure on companies to be more transparent as a first step to knowing how we can, hold them accountable on specific commitments that they make or they don't make. So that's why RDR was sort of like started in terms of having a baseline understanding of what companies commit to, with, from very basic aspects like, do you have a human rights policy? Do you commit to respect privacy and freedom of expression? How is your board of directors composed? Like, do you oversee human rights aspects within that board of directors? And do they have oversight over decisions affecting product design or affecting the specific introduction of programs within the company, right? So throughout these past decades, we have been carrying out an assessment of different tech companies and telecommunications companies on all of these standards. And in early last year, in 2024, we transitioned to now the World Benchmarking Alliance, which they've also been doing a lot of that work on the tech sector, but from the digital inclusion aspects. So this is the whole part that I hope it's not super confusing, but let me know in any case, and happy to clarify. So that's why now within the digital team, we have these two specific benchmarks or assessments of companies using two research methodologies. So using the RDR methodology to focus more on freedom of expression and access to information and the right to privacy, and on the digital inclusion side, as the name suggests, right? Things like access, the development of skills, all connected to inclusion. Next slide. I wanted to share this graphic because I find it. First, I find it's really awesome. It's from an organization in Brazil, and bless you. And I think it's great at sort of like showcasing the flows of how power moves and is concentrated in the world, but also it's great to visualize sort of like the supply chain, right? Which is a word that we use a lot in sustainability or in ESG, but basically just like to visualize the connections between the extraction of materials that we use in tech to the concentration of where the data is processed and who gets to decide on how that technology is basically, launched into the world. So I want you to keep this in mind for like our conversation today. Hopefully this can give us at least some idea in terms of like what questions we need to ask ourselves to challenge the sort of like pre-established or pre-digested positions that we hear often coming from tech companies, but also, and more concerningly, from tech media, which is unfortunately not as critical as we would like it to be nowadays. Next slide. So yeah, this is just to give you a sense of the latest edition of the Ranking Digital Rights Index. These are the companies that are assessed on the specifics of like indicators that we have. But you'll see that basically wanted to show you that there's still a really long way to go in terms of getting companies to like what we would consider the gold standard in a way. I hate the word checking boxes when it comes to, because it's not compliance, but in a way it's sort of like really bridging the gap to what companies are not really doing. And what you can see here is basically what companies lack. So it says a lot in terms of what they have as much as it says on what they don't have. So in the next slide, I can already name some examples. Oh, sorry, it has some animations. So basically, these are the measurement areas that we cover through the RDR index. So as I mentioned, like things from corporate governance aspects, like on, you know, a commitment to respect human rights in terms of also oversight. On freedom of expression, things like content governance, right? So how are companies laying out their policies around restricting content on their platforms or restricting the access to specific people? And on privacy, you can imagine things like data protection, so how data is collected, processed, inferred, shared with third parties, things like digital security, data breaches. So these are all of the sort of like really specific, what we call standards that companies are measured on. But I wanted to show you, because I think you'll find it more interesting. If you go to the next slides, just to show you like more specific set of sort of like questions that we assess, more connected to algorithmic systems, which is part of the latest methodology that we're using. So just as a general question, maybe, who here thinks that companies kind of like, how do you feel companies are doing when it comes to some of these questions? Or like just in conjunction, do you feel like they're going to be, who thinks maybe by raise of hands, like the companies are going to be at sort of like 50% mark in terms of transparency when it comes to showcasing how they do all of these things? Who thinks it's going to be below 50, below 30%? Below 30, usually? You can move to the next slide. Yeah, not great. Yeah. Yeah, Telefonica has been the only one kind of like above 40, almost, the one closer to 50. They have some really interesting policies and transparency when it comes to, especially at the corporate level, the oversight mechanisms when it comes to implementing and discussing how like they develop AI. But it's one of the few companies that have that. But yeah, this just gives you an idea about what still like the gap that remains to be bridged. And basically here, as I said, it's like an understanding of what companies lack, right? In terms of policies, in terms of laying out very clearly how they are implementing the use, the development of this tech, and really like at the service level. The way that we assess companies, just as a clarification, is also going through different sources that are public, so only what companies publish themselves. And this is basically one of the whole concepts of corporate accountability in terms of hopefully pressuring companies on being more transparent. So, you know, publish a specific policy, a document, something that lays out your position on how you're approaching this issue, so that we can call you out if you're not, you know, abiding by it, if you're not doing any work on it, or if you're actually working against it, which is something that we're seeing, or if you're even backpedaling, as we saw, for example, a couple of weeks ago with Google removing some language from their AI principles, right? So that's also why why we think the first step to accountability is transparency, just so we have that baseline in how we can call out these companies. And basically, just to I can move quickly on the other side of our work, which is on inclusion. And just to give you an idea of sort of like the measurement areas, if you go to the next slide, you can more clearly see sort of like the different aspects. What I mentioned, right, from access to tech, development of skills, how we use the technology. So a lot of emphasis on digital security, the impact on children online, how tech companies are connected to the development of the ecosystem, and I wanted to go more deeply into this specific indicator that we have on ethical AI, which if you go to the next slide, basically there's still also a long way to go. So we started this research in 2022, and you can see from the 200 companies that we assess on the digital inclusion benchmark, as of last year, only 71 companies had some sort of AI principle, AI guideline. So like a public document outlining how they approach the use of AI, or like how they see the role of AI within their company. There is some progress, but very slow. In the next slide, I think it's even more concerning that from the 200 companies, you can see that there's even fewer companies that actually demonstrate how all of these sort of like statements of intent translate to specific concrete actions for their specific businesses. So basically, from the 71 companies that have some sort of guideline or principle about AI, only 29 actually demonstrate how they implement that in practice. And when it comes to governance, or sort of like more of the oversight of how this specific technology is sort of like discussed at the corporate level, 41 companies demonstrated sort of like having some type of committee, some type of structure that discusses how the technology should be used within the company, right? Like who makes the decisions. We can go to maybe passing to the next slide, that one. And I think from my perspective as so like more on the human rights advocacy side, it's even more concerning that from those 71 companies that have some sort of principle, only 38 actually mention any sort of language related to human rights. So that, I think that says a lot. And something that we can touch on today as well, like during the discussion, is also the role of human rights impact assessments, and specifically on AI. Even fewer companies carry out human rights impact assessments for those specific products or services. So only 16 of those 200. We can go into like a full-on conversation about HRIAs. There are no specific frameworks or sort of like there's no single approach. So there's still sort of like a lot of companies doing their own take. So it's difficult to compare, again, between companies to companies. But also what I did want to say is that companies are very opaque when it comes to human rights impact assessments. So we also don't know a lot, even from those that do, that we know that they do these type of processes. They don't often publish the full reports. They only, at best, publish executive summaries. And they often do this together with sort of like more consultancy agencies, like VSR or Article 1. And it's not super transparent in terms of the results of these assessments. And that's not only about AI, that's just in general, like human rights impact assessments in general. yeah, maybe I can stop here with the slides because I'd love to have enough time for the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Leandro. And before moving into the third part of what this session, that will explore like a little bit more of the speculative side of or the tapped into the collective imagination, I have a question, a bit of an open question for both of you. Since you have this, you're working in like with the same orientation, human rights driven practices, but in like different sides of the ecosystems. And given the well, we're in a design school, trying to have this conversation with broadly designers. I'm curious, in your own experience, what have you seen that is the value that designers can bring to lawyers and researchers in this more corporate context, and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, I don't necessarily work in a corporate environment anymore, but when I did, I think designers have an incredibly important role to play. They are what makes products. When I've worked with all different kinds of companies, when you think of more traditional HCI researchers, they are often on a research team, or they're doing very different kinds of let's say UX testing, but you need designers that can transform research into products, and that is inherently the role of a designer, to understand best practices. Design patterns are incredibly important. They're based out of HCI research. They're based out of usability and accessibility patterns. There can be downsides to design patterns, like with dark patterns or harmful design patterns, but designers are what make products, and designers are what make products, I think, more human. And that's an incredibly important role. But I don't see I see all the value working together. I think a big issue is more just how perhaps companies are currently designed as a service design problem. I think that at least when I reflect back on having worked as a UX designer at Wikimedia, also at IBM, the work that I've done with different companies, the legal team is often very separate from the design team. Even if, for example, Wikimedia, the legal team is very friendly, whereas perhaps at other companies, it's very difficult to find them. I knew exactly where their office was, but it wasn't really in their purview or their workflow to be involved in our workflow, right? So when we were working on something, and I worked on a very specific, I worked on an anti-harassment team, which sits under trust and safety. So you would think that we would interface a lot with legal or policy, and we didn't really. They weren't a part of our stand-ups. They'd be a part of global stand-ups we were on, but they were not really a core part of our team. And I think that's one of the downsides. And I mean, especially with trust and safety, but I would say even outside of that, there needs to be much more cross collaboration between, let's say, much more traditional research teams, legal, and product. That's what makes the products probably the core of what that company is, very much stronger. I think instead, often what happens is something will go through a design process, and then maybe legal comes in at the very end. They approve it to go out into the world, or you're trying to retrofit some kind of change to fit a specific piece of regulation. Would have been much easier if they'd been a part of the process from the very beginning, right? Sitting and, let's say, explaining, or working through being a part of the beginning of the design sprint, how does GDPR fit into what it is we're thinking about, just as, a voice in the room, for example. I would say a downside is now it really does fall on designers to be that voice, to understand how regulation impacts their work, because a legal team is not brought in to the process, and that puts, I would argue, also a lot of strain on designers. It is a very difficult position sometimes to be in, to be the one that's sort of vocalizing, I don't think we should do this, I'm not sure if this is legal, depending upon the title of your role or aspects of your identity, you will not be listened to. So it does put a lot of stress on the designer. I know in certain instances like this, Harry Bringle, the inventor of the term dark patterns, he now uses deceptive design. I don't like deceptive design just because deceptive legally is a very narrow framing, but that's why I like harmful design patterns. But he has been working with a legal scholar and professor, Christiana Santos, to like create cases, like actual, like they're tracking court cases related to harmful design patterns. And his hope is that this can strengthen designers to be able to go to the website and say, hey, like this thing we're designing, this is actually being fined in this court in the EU, right? Like in this country, or hey, it's being this US court case, right? Like from the FTC was on this harmful design pattern, and this is how much money the company lost. So I know that that's a tool he's been working on and building. And I hope that those things are helpful. But you know, that still, again, very much falls to the, like, hopefully a designer on the design team to be able to advocate for that. And I do think that that is quite an unfair position to put the designer in.
Thanks, Caroline, and pass it on to you, Leandro, from your legal experience mindset as well. What is your take on this topic?
I think Caroline's points really resonate with me. I think in terms of the disconnect between different teams within companies, that's something that I've heard like several times. And especially,
just to interrupt, at IBM, I could not tell you where the legal team sat or what city or country they were located in.
It's not surprising. But that's something that we hear all the time when it comes to especially big tech companies. And how it's like legal or compliance of like parachuting in when the products are already almost out of the oven. I think where to start, maybe I think it's even more important now from a sort of like a designer perspective, starting to be more mindful of all of these specific considerations. And I'm thinking specifically as we're seeing a lot of layoffs and the shrinking of specific departments within companies when it comes to policy teams, human rights teams. So it feels like we have more of a collective moral obligation to be aware of all of these specific ramifications of the work, right? That is done at different levels. And that is, as Caroline said, like it's difficult to put that on a specific role or individual. But hopefully, ideally from these specific conversations and trying to have this sort of like broader perspectives, it helps in terms of distributing the workloads, because that's also in a way of like having some sort of checks and balances, right? Throughout the whole life cycle of the development of the product or service. On my notes, I wrote, things like how can we move beyond sort of like checkboxing compliance, and I think the main example that comes to mind is like how can we avoid at all costs the case of like the cookie banners and those sort of situations where we're translating regulations into specific user interface or user experience decisions that are not so friendly. But I think more importantly, when it comes to AI, what I had in mind was like, or what interests me the most is like the role of designers in terms of defining the contours of what we call AI and what we call what we refer to as algorithmic systems. And I was actually thinking coming into the session today, like we keep hearing in the news, and that's why I say that I feel like the tech media is often very irresponsible in the coverage of AI in general, treating it as sort of like a magic umbrella that conveys everything from a machine learning algorithm to an LLM to you name it. So I feel like from the perspective of designers, I would like to see more of that agency and ownership in terms of defining, fully what these services, what the products are. Because I feel like a lot of these terms remove that agency from the people actually developing the tech, designing how we as people use that technology, right? I was reading something about the computational metaphor a couple of days ago, right? In terms of how we think about AI as a brain, or how people talk about AI as a brain, and who those metaphors serve or don't, like who those metaphors end up harming. And I feel like as, designers of technology or product, services, you name it, you have a role as well on shaping how, that specific tech is seen by people. And I hate referring to people as users because that also has a tricky connotation. So yeah, that's why I use sort of like people to refer to how we interact with tech. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that as well? I love to keep it more conversational as well.
No, totally. I mean, I think I'm always a big fan of like why AI. Because I think we could definitely go down a rabbit hole of like how journalism contributes to this, but they're also like an industry that's being like radically defunded. Like to be a journalist today, I think is incredibly hard. Like you are having to do like double the amount of work for like less than the normal amount of pay, right? Like you have to pump out articles. But I also think, like we live in a world of clickbait and they have to like write clickbait. It's like an Ouroboros. It's like a snake eating its own tail and we're kind of just like stuck in it, right? But I mean, I don't know. I think I think designers are obviously integral to AI, but I also think it's so difficult to fight against what I see is actually a much larger problem, which is like the VC venture capital hype machine around AI. Like if you were to slap AI onto anything, you for a while could get so much more money. So that's how you had like AI in toothbrushes. It's not really artificial intelligence in the toothbrush, but also like, do you need those patterns of analysis? Are they really useful? Is this data meaningful? So I often like really encourage people to sort of like remove AI and think about, well, like what is the meaning of the product? How is it using data? Because data is integral to AI. How are you treating that data as a very precious material? How are you sort of stewarding or honoring that data? Because it's from people, usually, always. But also like, yeah, is it useful? Or is it, not that everything has to be useful, but also like what kind of joy does it bring? And then how does it harm, even unintentionally? And I think those are a lot of the questions that I wish we had time to bring back into design. It does feel like we're entering very much like a winter, if you will, and maybe I'm just really biased from what's happening in our industry right now, but it feels like we're entering another global recession. So I feel sad because I don't think we'll have the proper time to sort of grapple with these complexities. I feel like the next few years might be the era of like clickbait headlines and really short deadlines and not enough funding to do, really meaningful work, which is a bummer.
No, I love that you bring up so like the role of VCs specifically in shaping. I was just like waiting for that to happen today.
I mean, they bear such a large responsibility for a lot of like the AI crap in the world.
So basically, who here is familiar with sort of like the concept of venture capital, Silicon Valley 2-3? Okay.
Who doesn't really know what it is?
Yeah.
Because we'll still explain it. Okay. All right, yeah.
Do you want to?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. Like venture capital are like a bunch of people, usually dudes with like money, and they invest in products and startups early on. They often end up then owning like a percentage of the product, right? So when you're like running through a startup, you're going through many different rounds of funding. Usually the first round is like friends and family. Are we pulling up some memes? Yes, we are. And like friends and family is where you're getting like a teeny bit of money from people that you know to like just get a product off the ground. And then you have different series of funding and they will get like bigger and bigger and bigger. Those funders are usually buying ownership into your company. They'll eventually make money when you sell the company to a larger company. That's kind of the payoff. A lot of VCs expect that, like, I think 90% of their portfolio to fail. So they only need a very small percentage of the portfolio to really take off, because when those take off, it's often like $1 billion or like multi-$100 million entities. So they will really fund anything in some cases. If it's aligning with like a certain level of hype, a lot of them, again, are usually like white wealthy men, I think, from like the global north. So like if it's something that they can see a direct use case for, they're also like much more likely to fund it. Yeah, so like that's how you can end up with an AI powered toothbrush.
Yeah. Basically, I think it also goes or speaks to the culture within Silicon Valley, which is probably something that you've heard a million times or not. And if you want to talk about that, like,
yeah, we can get into it. Let's do it.
We're your people. I
lived
for
briefly in San Francisco, and I hated every minute of it.
But basically, the whole culture can be briefly explained as, if you have an idea and you believe in it long enough, everyone else in the world is gonna, buy into it. So a very confident middle-aged white man, just basically pushing it, and as long as I can funnel millions or billions of dollars, people are gonna buy into the idea. But yeah, so one great example in the VC world is SoftBank, which is a Japanese company. They made a lot of money with Alibaba, if I'm not mistaken. They have shares in Alibaba, and that's how basically they can fund a lot of their investments that are not always super smart. So right now, SoftBank is one of the main companies behind the funding of OpenAI, for example, and basically just like leveraging debt on their shares to fund a lot of the work that these startups are doing. But yeah, as Caroline said, I think the most important point is sort of like the cultural capture of these specific firms that are super opaque on how companies grow. I think that's the most concerning aspect of VC, is sort of like the growth at all cost mentality, in terms of like, as long as we can just burn money and keep this afloat, we can just, at some point turn them into something profitable.
I mean, that's also the current IBM model. I did really enjoy my time working there, but that is like its model where, they make a lot of money from like the legacy systems they still maintain and sell. But then their model is to buy lots and lots of startups and hope that one of those will also take off as like a core B2B component.
Yeah. I think a huge aspect of the sort of like growth aspect as well, which I think it's directly tied to the issues that we see in the AI sort of like ecosystem today. It's the whole mentality about capturing specific markets, and so going to sort of like the VC ecosystem, you can see it in different services like ride sharing, and if you're first to the market and sort of like monopolize it or capture it as you're the sole provider of that market, you can then sort of like control how that market grows or moves, and then eventually raise prices or develop a worse product for people. And we see that happening with ride sharing, with food delivery, anything that is based on labor exploitation as the basis of a business model. So if your business model is based on exploiting labor, maybe it's not a great business model to have. And in AI, we see that with what we call the invisible data workers, which is basically the people that need to go through all the specific individual pieces of content used to train the models, and categorize or tag or sort of like clean up the data, to say that, a picture with a car, shows a car or shows a dog or a person. So there's people sort of like manually tagging, but that's part of it. A lot of that I think can be automated to some extent, but there's a lot of outsourcing by companies, and that also speaks to how a lot of these companies are enabled to grow thanks to that whole side of, again, the supply chain, using labor, and one of the main hubs is in Kenya, with a lot of workers based in Nairobi, especially, and we're starting to see more sort of like unions and workers getting together to make this more visible as the other side of sort of like how that exploitation of labor is, in a way, allowing a lot of these companies to operate the way that they are.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you were able in this short conversation to connect all the dots between, why are we talking about VC if I came for human rights? And then I shared on the screen this amazing project called the Data Workers Inquiry. If you are curious about learning first-hand testimonials of the people making all these ChatGPTs of the world work and their living conditions, I strongly recommend to check out the work that this initiative is doing. And moving into the last part of the session today, I will play a short video that is a little bit of a prompt for our imaginations, and then we'll come back to our guest. We are going to learn about more than human rights. We have been briefly discussing human rights in this context, but what about more than human rights? And this is something that our group in the master have been already doing some creative research projects around. So let's learn from this initiative that is actually started by a lawyer in NYU. Well, he will explain in this short video. I don't want to make Chrome faster. Thank you.
In the 21st century, we're facing simultaneous ecological challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. This raises crucial questions. How to make sense of this situation and what to do about it? Our answer should address the root cause of these problems, the disconnect of humanity from the larger web of life that supports and sustains it. Hi, my name is Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, and I'm a clinical professor of law at NYU School of Law and the founding director of the Earth Rights Advocacy Program here at New York University School of Law. In this lesson, I will explain a concept that I have called more than human rights. I will explain what this concept means, how it can be used effectively in human rights advocacy and research, and how it can be used also to address urgent ecological challenges that can save us, protect the Earth. But first, let's talk about MOTH and what we do in this project. The MOTH Collective is led by Earth Rights Advocacy, or ERA for short, a global collaborative hub based here at NYU School of Law. At ERA, we conduct research, strategic litigation, and advocacy in order to address urgent ecological challenges such as climate change and biodiversity loss. The idea behind thinking and talking about more than human rights is to broaden the way that we understand human rights. This means considering the interest of the non-human world and the biosphere in an understanding of human rights at large. The concept of more than human rights seeks to push forward the recognition of the rights of nature, the rights of non-humans. But more importantly, it seeks to revamp, to reframe the understanding of rights in general, including human rights. So how do we come up with this concept? In Western culture, our thinking has been informed by the idea that there's a hierarchy of beings, with humans at the top and then everyone else at the bottom. Being smart, able to learn, able to feel and communicate with others have been seen as being distinctively human and have been used to put us at the top of that hierarchy. As we go down the traditional hierarchy, people care less and less about the well-being of the non-human world. Human rights law and practice have also been anthropocentric. In fact, human rights are considered to be ways to protect human individuals of the human species against abuses from governments and other individuals. However, to effectively address the ongoing ecological challenges, we need to embrace alternative ways of understanding and interacting with the world. Our best hope lies in adopting knowledges and practices that challenge anthropocentrism itself and reconnect us with the rest of the natural world. If it wants to stay relevant and impactful, the Human Rights Project needs to take seriously the rights, interests, and well-being of non-humans. Where can we get ideas and inspiration to expand the concept of rights to include non-humans? The idea of multi-rights draws on three important areas of knowledge. First, deep ecology teaches us that humans are connected to all forms of life on the planet, as we're made up of them, from the microbes in our gut to the air we breathe. Second, recent discoveries in scientific fields that have been called the complementary sciences demonstrate how interconnected various forms of life are. Scientists such as botanists and mycologists have been studying how plants, insects, and fungi communicate, learn, and solve problems with one another and their environment. And third, the idea of multi-rights dialogues with indigenous systems of knowledge that see humans and nature as inseparable and recognize human and non-human agency alike. Therefore, the more than human rights approach goes beyond two other related approaches: the right to a healthy environment and rights of nature. The right to a healthy environment is now well established both in domestic and international law, and it is a crucial tool in advancing the protection of life on Earth. However, it is centered on an understanding that separates humans from their environment. The idea of granting legal rights to nature, such as animals, forests, and rivers, is gaining recognition through various legal norms and court rulings. This approach is useful for challenging human-centered legal perspectives and has contributed significantly to legal theory and practice. The idea of more than human rights is closely related to the rights of nature, but it avoids the traditional separation between nature and culture, between human and non-human, by using the concept of more than human world instead of nature. More than human rights is not only about the law. It involves science, philosophy, emotions, aesthetics, culture. This requires incorporating and taking seriously forms of creating, feeling, and thinking about the world that are often underutilized in human rights and legal work. Now, how to apply the both approach? The Sarayaku people in Ecuador have been leading the movement for decades and serve as an example of how impactful ideas can be and what the approach looks like in action. Together with indigenous movement and other actors, they convinced the 2008 Constitutional Assembly to recognize nature as a subject of rights and the pursuit of the indigenous principle of good life as a constitutional goal and as an individual right and duty. The Sarayaku people have won important lawsuits to protect the Amazon. Their activism is not only about protecting the Amazon, though, but also about safeguarding the living earth as a whole, including the living forest, which they call Tacha. Ultimately, their power lies at the level of the transformation of human consciousness and culture. That is what moth rights are all about. Keep an eye out for new publications, offerings, and resources from the More Than Human Rights Project. You can find us at mothrights.org.
Okay, now that I shared this very, in my opinion, very inspiring approach to all of these topics, I have a question for you. So what do you think that people in the room or watching this, designers and designers working inside companies, what, from your perspective and your experience, what do you think that we can do today, or well, tomorrow is Friday, maybe Monday, to embed human rights and more than human rights approaches and practices, in particular when using and engaging with AI systems and more broadly speaking, AI narratives, as you have been referring?
I guess the politically correct answer would be starting with thinking on the role of human rights due diligence processes, which is basically an ongoing process in which you figure out the ways in which in this case, specific products or specific services may have direct or indirect impact on human rights, and the idea is that you do that for every single human right. But of course, you can start by prioritizing and having an idea of which rights might be more connected to specific harms. And the whole idea is to kind of like understand both potential harms, harms that may be already kind of like occurring, and throughout sort of like the whole, again, supply chain. So throughout the whole sort of like life cycle of the development, use, and implementation. So you can do that, for example, through human rights impact assessments. And I know for a fact that Caroline has shared also great frameworks that hone in on specific aspects like the right to privacy, which, for example, data protection is one aspect that is covered through, to protect the right to privacy, but it's not the only one. So that would be kind of like the concise or like technical answer, I guess. But I have a whole bunch of thoughts in terms of like how to approach this from like, AI narratives. But yeah.
I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on AI narratives. I mean, I also agree. I think there's a lot of frameworks out there that, may not be written exactly for the design process, but I think that's like the strength of us as designers. This is what we are here to do, is to be translators and facilitators of experiences for people. So I really encourage all of you, not just my students, to like take different frameworks, different privacy by design frameworks that are out there just as one example, and really try to apply them to your own practice. What needs to shift or change? How are you interpreting what those are? I do think it is really going beyond compliance. We are in the EU, like you are held to the EU AI Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and GDPR. And if you don't know what those are, it is worth going to a website called Tech Policy Press and reading a little bit about them. Because these are things, regardless, like if you're working here, you're in Spain, you're studying here, these are things that you are held to. And I do think it is worth thinking about. Regulation is hard to read, but how will these impact your design practice as designers? These are the laws of where you are. And I like to say that I think constraint builds innovation. Like, we're designers, we're here to solve wicked design problems. And I think regulation actually can really build innovation by looking at, okay, if I can't do this thing, like what would be a copyright, what would be an OpenAI if they followed copyright? That I think when we have a great example of that, spawning AI, right? We can see that that's built in Germany. It's following EU regulation, right? And it's interesting. Like, there are things you can make. And I always get really annoyed and also sad when people are like, it's hard to do this. Well, like, our work is hard. That's what makes it really interesting, though. Like, if it were easy, wouldn't we just become a little boring and compliant? The goal is to really deal with these as, I think, wicked design problems and greet them not with frustration, but I think with excitement. There's always constraints in your work. There will be monetary constraints or time constraints. These are just another form of constraint.
I love that. Just to react, I think on the issue of constraints, I think another great example is like going to DeepSeek as showcasing kind of like the other side of what happens when, although there's still a lot of like question marks on kind of like the actual sort of like training process and the sort of like data that they use and all of that, but I think it challenges the conception of if we can simply pour billions of dollars into a technology, it's magically going to be developed and it's going to be the greatest. And I think that's also sort of like the moral compass, right? When it comes to designing and thinking about what issues we're trying to solve. And I think Caroline mentioned it already, right? Like, I think that the tech ecosystem always falls into the trap, mostly, pushed by VCs again, of having a solution and then having to invent the problem because it's not actually a solution. They simply came up with an idea.
AI toothbrush.
So I think that, that's also sort of like the call to action, right? Like, how should we think about the needs that we have as a society, as a connected society. And as we saw on the video, right? Like, not necessarily as only humans, but as, how we cohabitate the world. And there's a lot of sort of like initiatives trying to bring more specific demands on how the tech ecosystem is moving on that direction, or needs to move into that direction. Like, how do we design technology within the bounds of our world? So I would urge you to look into the Green Screen Coalition, which they wrote a statement in the context of the AI Summit with a bunch of demands about phasing out fossil fuels, how to develop computing within limits, responsible supply chains, equitable participation of the communities impacted. Again, like going into, for example, labor exploitation, but also discrimination. And how do we think on all of these specific layers to think about the solutions that we actually want to design and develop and put out into the world? So it's like, I think it's our moral imperative in a way to think about design from that perspective of what other layers we need to abide by, labor, the environment. I don't know if you've seen the campaign Save the AI or not, but I think it's great with like some really specific numbers in terms of the impact, the water usage and the energy, the electricity impact of AI, and basically like half a liter of water is consumed when you simply use sort of like an AI system to prompt a 100-word email text. And you can imagine that is even greater when you think about sort of like graphics, like images, or videos, like Sora. And yeah, it's not going to get better. So that's the worrisome aspect of it. It's that, we're in that sort of like race of how can we simply, connect more GPUs together to make the machine bigger and bigger. So that's what concerns me, I think the most.
Well, and also not to make it sound so doom and gloom, this is something that Colin, and I forget his last name, but he's like the policy lead at Spawning, has really pointed out. We've also reached an interesting place with model and model development in which we actually don't need as much data. We don't need as large computers. We actually can start making small AI, and it will work fairly comparable to like systems that are having to use LLMs, for example. But yeah, so there is also like, this isn't to say no AI, though sometimes I would say why AI.
Yeah.
But like we are hitting really important sort of technology points in which we actually don't need the size and scale of how we've imagined AI to be. It actually can be much smaller.
Yeah, but also I think like honing in on the specific implementation, and that's also what's very frustrating with the whole conversation now, in terms of like how everything is categorized as AI. Like going back to that point, that a lot of the nuance gets lost in terms of the specific purposes, right? That we actually, would like as a society to be, for that tech to be implemented in. Like, from using computer vision to identify maybe cancer in patients, to, I don't know, translation. So there's a lot of like specific uses that, as Caroline said, that maybe they don't require as much compute as they want us to believe that is needed, simply because it kind of like conveniently helps one specific business model of one specific type of company on LLM, like using large language models, right? But also I think the other layer that I didn't want to forget to mention is like how we as people that not only use technology, but also if you're in a position of like thinking about designing a product or a service, how your decisions about the infrastructure that you use to build those services and products is also important to basically avoid further concentration of power. So like the main winners in the whole ecosystem is basically Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, right? With AWS, with Azure, with Google Cloud. And they are the ones that own the data centers, that own the infrastructure to process the data, to use the models. And I think we're starting slowly to see sort of like more of the reaction to that, especially now in Europe, right? Like alternative services, alternative, so like data centers. But I think that also brings like another layer, right? Of going back to the sort of like cartographies of the internet map that I showed you earlier. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes for a couple questions if there are in the room. Are there any?
Or comments. Hey, I don't know. Should I be scared of comments from the group? You know them better than I do.
Ooh. You might get nice comments.
I have a question, not a comment. So I have two. Like one is about this map. Is that the are the sizes a critique of power imbalances also, or like the size of the continents? Or
I didn't design it, so I don't know.
Okay.
But I think it's, yeah, the idea is to kind of like allure at, at it a bit.
I think it's also
not necessarily,
maybe.
but-
No, I was gonna say I wonder if
Does
it's
that
like
is
trying
that
to
tied
be
into
more like a
the
Mercator
tokens?
map, but
More like that?
oh, like an actual, what is it, like accurate map? But I'm not sure if it is.
Yeah, maybe I can show the website, maybe.
Give the microphone back. I just wanted to also ask, just how do you use AI in your daily practice, or do you even use it? I forgot to ask in class.
I'm not taking that one first.
No, really, I want to hear how you use AI in your daily practice.
I mean, daily would be a stretched.
Do you use search engines?
Yes. That's the thing, right? Like going to like everything is
Do
AI.
you use autocorrect?
Well, I mean, I use Instagram, and that has like an algorithmic feed, so I guess technically I use AI. Yeah, so I guess it depends on what you mean.
Gen AI?
Maybe specifically Gen AI.
I mean, I red team generative AI tools as like a research method,
Nice.
but I wouldn't say that I like use it, but I have like, I mean, I make my own photographic data sets and then make my own GANs.
Awesome.
Yeah, so like I do a lot of small data, small AI in an artistic context. But I don't really use generative AI. I mean, I really, other than like for like the work that Eric Salvaggio and I do under ARG, the Algorithmic Resistance Research Group, but I'm always just a big fan of like trying to make things like with my hands as much as I can. But what I like about building like data sets and then building a model out of that is I see the images that I've taken in the model like very well. I think that there's something really like nice and meditative, also maddening at times of having to do the labeling myself. But I like that, like it feels very intentional. So I'm not like anti AI at all, especially in art. I think it can be incredibly useful. I just always encourage folks to think about the intentionality. So like when tech companies are like, oh, I can't afford a designer, I'm like, I bet you can. Like, I bet if you looked maybe on Fiverr and really set an amount that was not exploitative, but maybe like, you know, I don't know the cost of what would be like if you ate out lunch every day for a week. I bet like the thing you needed, you actually could probably pay someone for. And if you want to be much more involved in that process of designing it, you can try to co-design with a designer, though I often don't recommend that just because that can be a very frustrating experience for the designer. But yeah, that's how I use, I guess, AI really directly.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I really like photography. I practice that as a hobby. So I have very strong opinions on how awful Gen AI is on like images. To be candid, and I think especially in the context of like water usage, electricity usage is, I think, increasingly kind of like a persistent thought as I go into like seeing that tech in practice. And it's like, you know, here in Barcelona, like just last year, we were still going through the consequences of a drought. So I feel like for a lot of people, it's still something very tangible, like the connection between how a tech that's been processed several, 1,000 kilometers away may have like very real impacts on the water that you consume at home. So yeah, I think that's always at the back of my mind. So it's a bit tricky. I have sort of like tested it just because it's like part of our work. Like we need to understand how these companies are actually putting out the products out there. But I think it's increasingly more, I don't know, just, yeah. I'm trying to find an adjective that's polite enough, but
I'll try to make it not too vague. When you were addressing the venture capitalists and right, and the whole acquisition cycle, I mean, we know it's very impacted also by regulation a bit, from my understanding. So, for example, there was just a recent acquisition by Google that was held back because they were actually afraid of like the monopolies regulations, and then like when when Trump got in, so they did the purchase. And I'm just wondering, how do you see this integrating like also like with human rights aspects in terms of, because if regulations are enabling like to scare, let's say, like these monopolies, right, acquisitions and things like that, can it also impact things, for example, like the human labor in Kenya? So for example, if in one country there are some things that are not allowed, so this company cannot do it like globally, so things like that. And how is your work also intertwined with regulations aspects?
I mean, competition.
They hear from me like many hours.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard from you, so I'm still very much interested in that. But I guess, the competition aspect is a great point. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, in the US, the FTC is under control of not a super great administration now. There was a great commissioner that's not there anymore. So that's very unfortunate. But yeah, I think like going to the VC point, I think that the whole, from my understanding, the whole sort of like pipeline, it's basically designing startup. Like a lot of startups are born with the whole purpose of exiting and being bought by a bigger company, right? Like, and in a lot of ways, it does feel like OpenAI is trying to be bought by some other companies, like maybe Microsoft. Although Microsoft has some, controlling, tentacles in different ways, but I feel like it's part of like the ecosystem. But yeah, it would be interesting to understand. Like I think like other regulations outside competition are more important, like labor. Again, I feel like a lot of what's happened, a lot of the so like Silicon Valley culture wouldn't work here just because of labor laws in the EU.
I would say that that's probably pretty true in some aspects. I mean, California's been trying to fight like large impact of the gig economy, but the downsides, they have made it much more difficult for folks to be freelancers. But they've been trying to pass different kinds of laws that would, I think, either like, I think it would like limit how long someone can like sort of work for a company, not being considered like a core employee, right? So if you are like, if you're a gig economy worker for Uber and you're like working a certain amount of hours, and then you're working like I guess you could calculate all the hours across a certain amount of months. The idea would be like, that's actually something much more like a full-time jobs. And like, you should then start to be considered much more of an actual employee versus one where you would are most akin, my understanding is, to a freelancer, but I'm not a labor lawyer. But I also think like, I mean, I do think companies will start to like hop and move things around. Like that's why they'll like, you know, work with different labor forces, like with content moderators or like data workers in specific countries and areas. So like there are quite a few content moderators and data workers in Germany. Like they can be a part of a union, for example. Some of those are then like necessary for, if you're looking at content moderation, you would need folks that are working on very specific kinds of languages, and you'd want them housed in certain areas anyway. Germany has very specific, for example, like hate speech laws. So does I think a large chunk of the EU anyway. We don't have those hate speech laws in the US. So sometimes we want very localized labor forces anyway. But I also imagine that as there's more regulation, they'll start to move labor forces or open up, like hubs other places. Hopefully those places, like what's happening in Kenya, will unionize. So then like you just can't keep going and going and going around, right? But I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that like all regulation is different. So, like competition, or I think what you were also thinking about was maybe some of the antitrust, anti-monopoly stuff in the US. Like, you know, that is going to be different than like regulation around labor. That's going to be different than like regulation around data rights. There's just all different kinds of regulation, and companies are trying their best sometimes to avoid that, to varying levels of success and failure. But I would say I don't think a lot of VCs care about that, but I don't actually know a lot about VC culture in the EU. I only really know a little bit more about VC culture in the US. So I don't want to make assumptions about like what's happening here.
Okay, I think I will ask for a big applause for Caroline and Leandro, and for the great questions. Thank you so much for everything that you shared tonight. It's so important, and I just want to invite everyone to go and look for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles, very important, and see what you think. Thanks for being here, and hopefully see you next Thursday for the last of the Beyond sessions by the Master in Design for Responsible AI. Have a good night. Thank you.